This podcast is brought to you by lineupmedia.fm.
Because if you can tell me what your habits are, I can tell you what sort of a person you are. I can tell you what your future looks like.
But like I always say, life is 10% what happens to you, it's 90% what you do about it.
The people who are most effective in the workplace believe that their future is going to be bigger than their past. When people don't believe that their future is going to be bigger than their past, they begin to disengage.
You're listening to The Circuit of Success, a podcast dedicated to helping you achieve success in every facet of life. Only on the lineupmedia.fm podcast network. Now, your host, Brett Gilliland.
Welcome to the Circuit of Success. I'm your host, Brett Gilliland. Today, I've got Dr. Art Markman. Art, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I am great. Well, there's something that the people from Mattoon, Illinois, they know, and you're not from Mattoon. You live down in Austin, Texas, but you get some grad work done at University of Illinois. And we were just talking about the Bagel Fest capital of the world, which is Mattoon, Illinois.
That's right. I gather not a lot of people have been to the Bagel Fest.
No, not a lot of people have been there. And, but if you grew up in Mattoon like I did, you know exactly what it is. And then you also mentioned the Broomcorn Festival. So back in the day, and I think that was in Arthur or Arcola, I can't remember, but I went and there was this new country music guy that was coming. They thought he'd maybe be a big deal one day. And his name ended up being Garth Brooks. And I remember I literally was sitting on a hay bale on a stage, and there's this guy, my parents wanted to go there. I thought I'd rather die than be there, but I was there and I sat on stage and watched this new young country music singer. And then now here he is selling out shows in 15 minutes for 100,000 people.
Yeah. He did okay.
He's done okay. Well, you are a professor, you are an author, you are a radio/podcast host with two guys on your head, working at the down there in Austin, Texas, at the University of Texas. So it's great to be with you today. But if you can, Art, just give us a little lay of the land. What's made you the man you are today? And you don't just wake up and become a doctor and do all the things you're doing.
I usually talk to people when I try to think about how I ended up where I am. I think the most important thing for me has always been not editing my life story in the forward direction. That's sort of the through line. I went to college, not really sure what I wanted to study. Midway through my college career, realized that all the classes I liked had something to do with the mind. And an advisor said, well, it's possible you're a cognitive scientist. So I declared a major in cognitive science and really enjoyed it. Thought I might go into computer science because that was most of the courses that I'd taken. But in the mid 80s, computers were kind of slow and stupid. And late in my college career, I decided, maybe I'll try to go to graduate school in psychology. So I went and did that. Thought I'd spend my career purely as an academic, writing papers that get read by 30 of my closest colleagues and pumping out research papers and teaching classes. But about midway through my career, realized that almost everybody I know has a mind and not many of them know how it works. So I tried to bring a little bit of that information outward, and that led to some opportunities to consult for companies. And then the university, you have to declare at universities that you're consulting. They want you to bring your knowledge outward, but they don't necessarily, they just want to know what you're up to. And so I was consulting for companies, and they said, we're thinking of creating an outward facing master's program for the liberal arts to teach people about people. And that became a program called the Human Dimensions of Organizations that I helped to found at the university, that started as an executive master's program and became a continuing professional education program, as well as an undergraduate major. We've got about 500 students running around campus saying that they're HDO majors. Later on, I got a couple of years ago, I learned another valuable lesson, which is that when the provost of the university contacts you at 5 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon and says, "Can we talk?" that he's not about to make your life easier. And this was in April of 2020, he asked me if I would help to coordinate the COVID planning process for the university. And so I kind of dropped everything I was doing and helped us to navigate a pandemic. And from there ended up with a position in the provost's office as a vice provost running our continuing and professional education and academic affairs groups. And so, it's just been one thing after another. Even starting the podcast really came from giving a talk with a colleague of mine and having the woman who was producing the live event ask us if we wanted a radio show, and she saw something in us that we didn't, and she's been our producer of the show and the podcast ever since. So it's on the one hand better to be lucky than good, but it's also, I think, really just important not to assume that what is going to happen to you next, and to take the opportunities when they arise.
Yeah, you just took the words right out of my mouth there. I think what I hear from that is just saying yes, right? I mean, You can say a calculated yes, and of course you probably thought about it and made the great decisions that you've made, but sometimes we can overanalyze, can't we? And then we just don't make that step forward. And who knows where you'd be if you took one left or right turn. You may be in a different spot right now doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. If for one thing, if you limit yourself to the things that you thought of yourself as doing, you're limited by your imagination rather than the world, which is way more interesting than anything we can think of. And then on top of that, a lot of times people say, well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to do this thing. But A, you have to ask yourself, can I grow into it? And B, you have to ask yourself, if I don't do it, who are they going to ask to do it? And is that person necessarily going to be more qualified or better at it than I am? And often when you really think about it, you realize, no, actually, I can handle this, or at least I can learn to handle this. And even though I might not be 100% the right person, maybe nobody's 100% the right person, and maybe I'm at least as high a percentage of the right person as anybody else that they'd find.
Yeah, I love that. And it makes me think of a story, a guy I was working with as a professional coach. This is probably, a decade ago. And he was telling me, you got to bet on yourself. You got to take risk. And at what point are you going to trust yourself? Right. And he said, okay, Brett, he goes, I'm in the wealth management space. And he goes, okay, if you have this company X that's done something well for 30 years, when are you going to start to trust that company may be a good stock to buy? We had that discussion, and I get that logically. He goes, but on the decisions for professionalism, he goes, you're that company for 30 years, right? If you've been doing something for 10, 20, 30 years, when are we going to start to trust ourselves that we are the stock, the quote unquote, air quote stocks here, if you're just listening to this, that you would buy, right? And I think that's where we got to bet on ourselves and believe in ourselves. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, we have to be willing to recognize what our strengths are. And I often tell people that we also have to treat ourselves at least as well as we treat our friends. And so a lot of times, for example, if you make a mistake, you can get really down on yourself. You can say, I'm not as good at this as I thought. I should just give up. If you had a friend who made a mistake and something went wrong in their professional life, you wouldn't look at them and say, wow, you ought to just give up. You just walk away.
That would not be good.
But you'd never do that. You would find their strengths. You would help them to see the various ways that they can actually contribute. And yet when it happens to ourselves, we overlook those strengths. We second guess a lot of the things that we do. And I think we have to recognize, we not only have to be willing to bet on ourselves, we have to be willing to look appropriately at our own balance sheet and recognize the assets that we have as well as the liabilities.
Yeah. So I want to dive in. I usually wait till later in the podcast to talk about this, but I just had an experience. So I haven't flown in an airplane for 8 years, and it's this massive fear I had, right? And I always talk about the fears we put in our mind. They never blow up to the magnitude we put them in our minds to be, right? And that's just person after person. We've talked about this, and I put this thing in my mind that, that I'm going to be on this airplane. I'm going to have this panic attack. I'm going to do all this bad stuff's going to happen. And we went on a friend's birthday. There were 6 couples. We just went to Tahoe this past weekend, and this calmness came over me, right? So I had to face the fear, scared to death. The week leading up to it was brutal. It's all I thought about. And so when you hear me talk through that, what have you either helped people with, or what advice would you have for people that are having that same fear that wasn't realistic because the plane ride ended up being nothing, right? It wasn't a big deal, but yet you build it up for years and years and years to be terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually several pieces of this that are really important to think about. I mean, for one, I'll tell a slightly different story, which is I was really struck years ago by the movie Bridge of Spies, which Mark Rylance plays a spy who gets arrested, and Tom Hanks is a lawyer who's trying to get him freed. And there's a scene late in the movie. There's a trial that's just about to start, and Tom Hanks walks into the prison cell and he looks at the Mark Rylance character and he says, "You don't look worried. It's the day before this big trial. You don't look worried." And he looked at him and he said, "Would it help?" And I loved that distillation of it, because it's not that worry or anxiety or stress is inherently a bad thing, but it has to be directed in the right places. And a lot of times we spend our energy getting worried about things we can't do anything about. And so we create fears and we ruminate over things that are utterly out of our control. And so part of the question we need to ask ourselves in any situation is, would worrying about this help? And if it would, worry away, think it through, plan differently. And if it won't, if that extra effort won't help, then you've got to kind of give that up and be willing to trust that the rest of the things that happen in the world are going to happen as they normally do. And, is there a risk associated with flying? Yeah, there is. It's a small risk. It's a much smaller risk than the things that we take on all the time, like getting in the car and driving somewhere. But at the moment that you get on that plane, there's nothing you can do about it anymore. Yep. And so at that point, you just got to trust that the universe is going to do the things that it's always done. And I think that there's so much in our lives that are like that, where we worry about the wrong things. We worry about the things we can't do anything about, but we under worry about some of the things we probably could do something about. So, you look, for example, at people who don't make a will, for example, because it's uncomfortable to think about your own death. Yeah. And so we put that out of our minds, and then we do things that actually harm our loved ones, where a little bit of extra planning and worry actually would have been really useful. So I believe in both sides of that equation.
Yeah, that's great. I love that we under worry about the things that we should worry about. You're spot on that. So, but how do logically that makes sense, right? Like, I know there's a greater likelihood that I'm going to get in a car wreck driving to the airport than the actual plane ride wrecking, right? But logically, I know that, but it's hard to do that. So what advice would you have other than telling ourselves, just don't worry about it? Like, what would you do? How would we do that?
Yeah. So the other piece that we need to understand is that worry is fundamentally about the stressors, the threats that are out there in the world. And so sometimes when there's something that intellectually isn't really a threat, but you're worried about it anyhow, what all the research on cognitive behavioral therapies tells us is you have to face that fear. You have to just do it, and without doing anything else, just face it and go through it. And a lot of times you will end up with that same sense of calm that you were talking about. And it makes it easier to do that thing again in the future. You still might worry the next time you're going to get on a plane, but it'll be less. And when you face it again, it'll be less and less. And at some point it'll just go away. So you have to face that. And it's because essentially even if the intellectual centers, those cognitive centers of your brain, understand that you're not taking a risk, those deeper motivational centers aren't necessarily listening to that cognitive center. And so part of what you need to do is also to face it, to teach that much older segment of your brain, oh, there really wasn't anything out there that was threatening, even though I was worried about it.
Yeah. And you're spot on too with having to, the more you do it, right? I mean, I used to be really worried about public speaking, but now the more you do it, then it just goes away, and you want to have some nerves, or it means you don't care, right? But the healthy nerves. And I think whether it's playing, whether it's taking the risk at work or at home, whatever it may be, I think the more you do it, the faster we get outside of that comfort zone, the easier it becomes.
Yeah. Yeah. And with public speaking too, it's useful for people. Part of the problem with public speaking is I think that older section of the brain worries about it, but then the newer section of the brain worries about it too. They think, well, what if I give a terrible talk? And I actually tell people, carry that through to its absurd but logical conclusion, right? You've been to lots of bad talks. Generally speaking, you just forget them. So,
that's right.
So the worst case scenario.
Sucks in the moment, but
that's right. But the worst case scenario is you go out and you give a bad talk and nobody remembers it.
That's right. That's right. That's the worst that's going to happen, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So let's talk about, I saw you maybe wrote, I think it was in one of the magazines you write in, but the habits of happy people. And, I think there's so much negativity going on in the world right now. So how do we find that extra zone, if you will, for happiness?
Yeah. It's interesting. We actually don't open up a lot of opportunities for happiness for ourselves. So we spend a lot of time, for example, really focusing on our responsibilities. And if you think about what a responsibility is fundamentally, if I don't do this thing, something bad's going to happen. And whenever you are focused on that kind of, if I don't do something, something bad's going to happen, then I'm really putting myself into that focus on stress and anxiety, like we were talking about before. And if you think about what happens when you're experiencing stress and anxiety, is when you successfully avoid the threat, you're not happy, you're relieved.
Yeah.
I made it through. So how can you actually create the opportunity for happiness? The first thing you have to recognize is that happiness comes when you achieve some beautiful, wonderful, desirable outcome that you were striving for. So you are trying to approach some beautiful thing. And when you do that successfully, you experience joy and happiness, which means that one of the things that happy people are really good at is seeing the world in terms of those opportunities to pursue beautiful things and achieving those things, and then celebrating those accomplishments when they do it. So you can, so for example, here we are doing this interview today. I could have looked at this on my schedule this morning and thought of it as, well, I just got to make sure I don't say anything wrong, and then I'd be worried about it. I'd be stressed before it. And when it was over, I'd just go, well, I'm glad that went okay. As opposed to looking at this as an opportunity to have a conversation with somebody new, to talk about some fun things, to potentially teach something to somebody that they didn't know before, and then to go through that experience and hopefully experience some joy as a result of that. And then another thing that happy people are really good at is taking a moment to celebrate the accomplishments. A lot of us, we finish something and we check it off the to-do list and we move on to the next thing. And maybe we think that it's a little bit self-serving to take a victory lap. And, I'm not so sure that you have to celebrate it by getting in everybody's face to do it, but creating little rituals to enjoy the things that you do. I know, back when I was spending most of my time writing papers for 30 of my closest colleagues, if you're a successful academic, if you have a great year, a great year, you publish 6 research papers over the course of that year, right? That would be a great year, which means that roughly once every 2 months, you get that piece of good news that says this paper that you've been working on is being published. Wow. So, first of all, you'd better enjoy some of the other things you're working on so that your only source of joy isn't getting a paper published. It's got to be enjoying the process itself. But also, after you find out that paper's been published, I used to have a little ritual I would go through. I would update my Vita and I would post a copy of it on a website and I would send it out to a couple of colleagues. And it was all just there to make sure that I took 15 minutes, 20 minutes to celebrate the accomplishment that was, before just going, well, that's nice, and then moving on to the next thing. You have to give yourself the opportunity to enjoy the things that you're doing. And it's not productive. It's not more productive to just immediately go on and do the next thing. We have to create space for that.
Yeah. And that's hard to do too, man. It's funny. I had this conversation with a friend one time. We hit a pretty big deal at work. This was just a couple years ago. And it's like, what did you do to celebrate? I'm like, well, I mean, I didn't. It just kind of, that's what I expected to get done. But when you really kind of peel that onion layer back, and it was a big deal, right? And so I said, you know what, I'm not going to do that anymore. So it's funny you're saying that, because it literally was a big conversation that we continue to still have now, is to slow down and do it. Because I think the gift of high expectations is great, but at the same time, that gift of high expectation does allow you just to move on and be like, yep, that was supposed to happen and I'm done, right? Let's go to the next thing.
That's right. No, it's exactly right. And, it is, I think you're absolutely right. It's important to have high expectations. It's important to have some self-confidence to pursue those, to believe that your efforts will be rewarded. The thing about motivation is we are motivated to do things when there's a gap between where we are right now and where we'd like to be, but a gap that we believe to be bridgeable, meaning that we believe that the actions that we're going to take will actually help us to achieve that outcome. So we need that level of confidence, but we can't allow that level of confidence that led us to believe that we could do this overshadow the accomplishment of actually doing it.
Yeah. So let's turn the page to curiosity. I think, I can't speak for you having a podcast, but for me, like, I'm a fairly curious person about people's stories, and it's kind of what makes them tick and all that kind of stuff. And so, but how do we become more curious at work, in our personal lives? How do we do that?
Yeah. And curiosity is incredibly important. In part, I just want to say this as an aside. I did a book several years ago called Smart Thinking. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that it is the quality of your knowledge that allows you to solve new problems in interesting ways. And the quality of your knowledge comes in part from just knowing a lot of things. When you look at the stories of really successful people, they are people who know a lot about a lot of things. So there's incredible value in that curiosity, and in particular in learning about things that you didn't realize that you needed to know until sometime later, when it turned out that information was useful. So I just want to make that case first, so that even those people who are doing a cost-benefit analysis on the time that they're spending should recognize that there's a lot of long-term payoff to being curious. But I think that a lot of what you need to do day to day to make that happen is to ask yourself why a lot. When you see something happening, ask yourself, do I really understand why that happens? And if I don't, to spend some time finding out why it happens. So if you notice a friend doing something interesting, talking to that friend, getting their story, but then maybe even digging into the psychology of it or the sociology of it or whatever it is. Or if there's, we hear stories on the news all the time about things that are happening in other countries. Understanding why things happen the way they do in those other places it's valuable. And once you start doing that and realizing that there are these interesting stories and interesting explanations everywhere, that does start to feed on itself, because now you realize not only are there all these interesting mysteries around us, but we can actually begin to dig into some of those. And it's just enriching. It's fun to find this, to find out.
I talk about ADT, ask, don't tell. I've found the better questions, and we all know this, right? But the better questions I can ask, right, the better answers I'm going to get. But not even just for other people, but for myself. Yeah. And for me, it's sitting here for those watching. It's this black journal right here, right? Mm-hmm. I can go in here and ask myself a lot of great questions. and hopefully get a lot of great answers by spending that strategic think time with just me. Yeah, there you go. You got one of the exact same thing, and it's just you and an ink pen in your mind. It can be a scary place, but it can also be a very, very productive place to spend some time in. And so while we're talking about productivity, let's talk about this. I mean, things for me that I learned during the pandemic is the productivity versus hours worked. I think that has probably changed in our world, maybe forever, maybe not. I don't know. But when you hear me talk about productivity versus hours worked, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there was definitely a long period of time where people took it as a badge of honor that they were going to spend a certain number of hours sitting at their desk each day, and that was going to somehow correlate to a certain level of productivity. And I think what we've known from a cognitive psychology standpoint for a long time is that you can only put forth a particular amount of focused effort in a day. And it's going to vary a little bit from person to person, and it's going to vary a little bit based on your habits. But for most of us, by the end of a 6-8 hour workday, there really isn't that much more focused effort you can put in. And to the extent that you push yourself to work a little bit more, which we all have to do sometimes because of deadlines or emergencies or other things, often what happens in those circumstances is that we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. We put in that extra effort, but then we spend the next day doing what I affectionately call fake work, where you sit at your desk and Google things at random, and you're at your desk, but you're not really at your desk. And so I think that we have to and I think what a lot of people have begun to discover because of COVID, because they were doing a lot of work from home, is that if you put in a good 6 or 8 hours, that you manage to get through a lot of the stuff on your to-do list, and you could finish, relax, do some other things, and still accomplish a lot later. I will say that one thing that's missing from that work from home piece is that there are a lot of workplace conversations that we miss out on, that we have to find a way to add back into our life again in some way. I mean, just this morning, so I'm working from the University of Texas campus, and I do have a certain number of meetings that happen each week in person. And today, just this morning, I was in a meeting with some of the other folks who work in our provost's office, and after the meeting was over, a conversation started between two people, and then 3 or 4 others of us stood around that conversation to listen in. And I learned several things through that conversation, but what was interesting was it's the sort of thing that would never have happened if we'd all just logged into a Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
Because we would have, the Zoom meeting would have ended, and very efficiently, we all would have logged off and gone on to the next thing. But by virtue of walking by this conversation, hearing something that I thought I wanted to know about, standing around and listening, I learned a new thing that I think will be valuable for me to know. And it also solidified my connection to a few other people. And that's the other piece, is we've been really good in this work from home environment at staying connected to the people who are directly part of our team. But what we've been less good at is staying connected to the people that we would bump into at the water cooler or in the parking lot, or, for me at a university, walking across campus, I'd bump into a colleague and get into a conversation that would then remind me of something or bring me into some other project. And it's those kinds of interactions that we've lost, and we feel really efficient. But I think there's a little bit of value in inefficiency, as if that inefficiency is basically allowing us to come into contact with some folks where having those conversations will ultimately be beneficial.
Yeah. I think it's huge for the culture too. For any culture at work, it just to even today, I had a quick time for some lunch, and me and an advisor, Scott here, just the two of us went, right. We got to talk about kids' baseballs and just, life. Right. And it's like those things are really important, even though it's nothing I quote unquote learned or it's something for work. It's just, that's time spent, and to check the box of that's good quality time spent with somebody from work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it builds that relationship. It creates that level of trust. I hear when you have a deeper relationship with someone, you feel like, okay, I know that this is somebody I can rely on. And it makes a lot of other things you do a lot easier later, because you think to yourself, okay, this is somebody I know where they're coming from.
Yep, absolutely. I heard you talk about this norm theory, NORM, norm theory. So if you could spend some time educating us on that, can you do that?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the idea behind norm theory, and this actually goes back to a paper back from the 1980s that Danny Kahneman, that many people will know from his book Thinking Fast and Slow, he did that. He wrote the initial paper on norm theory with one of his colleagues years ago. The idea behind norm theory, though, is when we're trying to evaluate the world around us, part of what we do is to compare it to worlds that could have been, in order to understand, did something go well? Did something go badly? Should I be upset about something? So for example, the classic example they used, which I love, is imagine two people who get into a traffic jam, heading to the airport. So they're trying to make a flight, and they get to the airport, and they each arrive at the airport. And one of them discovers that she missed her flight by a half hour. And the other one discovers that she thought she had missed her flight by a half hour, but actually her flight was delayed. And so it actually only took off 5 minutes ago. So the second person they're more upset, because they're thinking there are more worlds in which something slightly different could have happened and she would have made her flight, even though, technically speaking, they both reached the same outcome. And we do this a lot, because when we think about, for example, a business deal that didn't go through, part of what we're trying to figure out is, was I close?
Yeah.
And part of the way you're close is that if there's only a few things that could have gone differently and you would have succeeded, then you feel like, okay, I'm close. And it's upsetting in the moment, but it can also give you confidence that, if just a few things had broken differently, this would have worked out okay. Whereas, if you're trying to structure some kind of a deal and you realize, wow, this was just a total mess. And there's almost no world in which this would have gone right.
Right.
Then you realize, okay, I need to do things very differently in the future if I'm going to succeed. So this ability to conceptualize the world as being slightly different than it is, and thinking about what would have happened, that's really valuable. And I think we use that skill all the time as we try to learn from the failures that we have.
And when I hear you talk about that stuff, so it makes me think about think. Did your journal say think on it, or what did it?
It did.
Okay, yeah. So I thought I cut that it said think. And so how much time, whether the norm theory or just thinking, like how much time are you actually spending time with you and yourself and your journal and just thinking and thinking about these things that could have been, right?
Yeah. Well, I think most of us don't do it enough. Because,
I would agree.
Because we equate productivity with doing a thing that is specifically earmarked to a particular project, maybe having a meeting or writing a particular report. I think we all need to take a little bit more downtime. I've actually found that having taken on an administrative role at the university, I have less time to just sit and think about stuff. I have to create more opportunities for it. And so, when I can, because other people have access to my calendar, I have a few fictitious names I put on my calendar that are meetings with people, so that somebody doesn't schedule over it, but it's not really a meeting. It's just time for me to do something. But if I found that if I called it just, hold this time, then people would start putting stuff on it, because they'd say, well, he's not really doing anything then.
Exactly. He's just thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I have, if you looked at my calendar, I have it from 1 to 2:30 once a week on my calendar, where it just says strategic think time, and people know not to book over it. And it's just, for me, it's that time I need, but it's when I tell other people about it or tell somebody else to do it, it's hard for them. It's like, well, you don't understand. I got these emails and this and that and the other. And I'm like, well, I run up, some businesses and have 4 kids and, a wife, and I'm fairly busy myself, but again, it's what you choose to do with that time. And until you build the belief system around it, for me, it's non-negotiable. And so for me, like, that's one of my non-negotiables, like, to my core, you cannot convince me that spending an hour and a half by myself with a blank piece of paper is the most valuable use of time that there is. What is it to you, like, to your core, that maybe I couldn't shake you from thinking that this thing is absolutely a must-have on your calendar?
Yeah, for me, part of it is I love the opportunity to read some things that I'm not sure why I'm reading them yet. So, I mean, I still subscribe to paper copies of the scientific journals. And I do it because this way I just have it sitting there in front of me. And I have one open here right now next to me. I really need to take the time to just flip through it and pick something that I didn't know anything about and go read it, because it never fails that if I do that something that I've read will turn out to be useful later. I'll be glad I knew it.
It's amazing how many times it pulls up in a conversation, isn't it? Like within that week.
Yeah. And it's, and to me, that's the key. Because I think at the point where we stop doing that, that's the point where you really stop growing and you become the stale version of yourself.
Yeah, I agree. And that really makes me go into one of my next notes here is the imposter syndrome. I think that as soon as we can get rid of that imposter syndrome, I think we all do it when we're young professionals and you're trying to be this thing. But I have found once I was able to release that, shed that, whatever you want to call it, the happier I became, the more productivity I had, just the overall general wellness of what I was thinking.
Yeah. It's part of the problem that all of us have is you look around the world and you see skilled performers. And particularly early in your career, you think to yourself, wow, that person, they're really good at what they do. Whether you're watching a music performance and somebody's playing an instrument in an amazing way, or whether you're sitting at work and watching somebody address an issue in a way that you'd never thought of. And part of the problem is when you're watching that skilled performer, you don't see the path that they took to get them where they are now. And so what you see is the gap between who they are and who you are right now. And I think that what all of us need to realize is we are going to grow into the next version of ourselves. And we're going to make some mistakes along the way, but we're going to do a lot of interesting things in that path. And that every successful person you've ever seen has walked that path as well. And so that imposter syndrome comes from looking around thinking, I am not yet qualified to do the things that I think I will ultimately need to do. And the answer is, you're right, you're not yet qualified, but that doesn't mean you'll never be qualified. Although if you never try anything, you will not be qualified for those things. And so you have to be willing to walk that path. You have to be willing to find mentors who will walk you through things. You have to learn to find ways to try things with training wheels on. We don't just set somebody loose on a bicycle on day one. We ride for a couple of months with training wheels on, where we get used to the feel of the bike and the chance to wobble a little bit, where we can't do much damage to ourselves. And at work, there are lots of opportunities for training wheels, going into a meeting with a colleague who can back you up if you get into a situation that you can't handle. Those kinds of things give you a chance to try something, to get feedback from it, and to learn from it. And I think if the more that you treat everything as an adventure, the word we tend to use these days, we draw from Carol Dweck's work and talk about having a growth mindset. Yeah. But really, fundamentally, what that growth mindset is all about is the recognition that we're all developing into the person we're going to be. And we have to allow that to happen. And that the only way you learn anything is by trying things.
And it's okay if that thing you're trying, you fail. And in the moment, it might stink, but some of my best learnings are from the hardest moments professionally.
Yeah. Yeah. And one way to keep that fresh for yourself throughout your life is to try some brand new things every once in a while. I think a lot of us, we reach a certain point, particularly if you've had some success, you reach a point where you think, well, I'm not going to ever be the worst person in the room at something ever again. But my feeling is, no, you should be. You should actually find some things to do where you are the worst person in the room. So in my mid 30s, I took up the saxophone. And early on, I was pretty bad. but ultimately after playing for 10 years, I started playing in a band. So I got the hang of it. And the front end of COVID, I bought a bicycle, like one of those crazy light bikes. Yeah. But I fell several times at the beginning because I couldn't get my feet in those little clips. But I learned to do a new thing and put myself at the mercy of other people to show me what to do. And yeah, it's really valuable to keep going through those kinds of experiences where you're just not good at something for a while. Yeah. And it's a reminder that you can keep, becoming a newer version of yourself.
That's right. Well, they say Dom Perignon didn't even create that champagne until he's like in his 80s or something like that. I mean, it's all these stories. It's incredible. So the circuits of success, hence the name of the podcast that we're on here, the circuits of success, they are attitude, your belief system, your actions that ultimately get results. So attitude, beliefs, action, results. When you hear those, pick one of those four that kind of resonated with you early on. And let's spend some time talking about that.
Yeah, I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but I actually think actions matter a lot.
Yep.
It's because that's the place where the rubber meets the road, where you get a lot of feedback because when you try things, you disrupt the world around you, and you're gonna make mistakes.
Yep.
And that's the way to do it. I think it's funny. One of the things we talk about from in education, in the world of education, is that the best time to teach a kid a new language is when they're really young, and the ability to learn a new language declines significantly. And by the time you hit puberty, it's really hard to learn a new language. And so, of course, what do? We don't, in the US, we don't start teaching kids a second language until they hit puberty.
Yeah.
Now, why is it so hard to learn a new language? And the answer to that is a couple of things. One of which is that there are some brain changes that actually make it hard to learn some of the very subtle aspects of language as you get older. But the other thing is learning a new language requires speaking it and making mistakes and saying things that are wrong and sounding dumb. And kids are perfectly willing to do that. Young kids are perfectly willing to do that. And then as you get older, you become less and less willing to sound stupid.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so
that's right.
And so you don't act. And so, what's most important is that you should be willing to act even when you're not sure that your action is going to come out right. And that the only path to expert performance is non-expert performance.
Yeah, you're right. That's awesome. Well, this is good, man. This is really good, Art. I think my goal is always get one nugget, from somebody for an interview. And I think people are going to walk away with tons of nuggets here. And I'm very thankful for that. And so if you can, tell us about your books. You got Smart Thinking, Smart Change, Brain Briefs, and Bring Your Brain to Work. So what is that? 4 books? Author of 4 books. Congratulations on that. That's a big deal. So talk to us about those books and where can our listeners find more of them?
Sure. I like to bring insights from my field outward that I think people might find helpful. So Smart Thinking is really a book about how to think more effectively, how to develop really good knowledge and use it when you need it. Smart Change is really focused on changing your behavior, understanding your motivational system in order to be able to achieve your goals and to change your behavior when needed. Brain Briefs was a fun book that I actually wrote that with my buddy Bob Duke that I do my podcast or radio show with. The show itself, Two Guys on Your Head, which is available wherever there are podcasts, is a 7.5 minute segment that we produce for our local NPR affiliate. And so it's not a big time commitment for people to listen to. It's just 7.5 minutes. So what we did, on the podcast, we just pick random topics in psychology and talk about them for a while. And what we did in the book was to do the same thing. We just picked a bunch of random topics in psychology and wrote about them in what we hope was both an informative and amusing way. And then the most recent book, Bring Your Brain to Work, was trying to really apply a lot of what we know about cognitive science to thinking about your career. So everything from getting a job to excelling at the job that you're in to thinking about moving on to the next one or even changing a career. So, I write about these topics a lot. I mean, I certainly love it when people pick up the books, but I write regularly for Fast Company and Harvard Business Review and Psychology Today. And so I'm on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, and got an author page on Facebook. And, so if people want to find me, that's a good way to do it, because I post links to the things that I do. And I've got a website called smartthinkingbook.com that has that also has some information about the books, but I think social media is probably the best place to find me.
Which is how we connected. I sent you a message. I believe it was Jim Quick's book, Limitless, that talks about you in that book. And that's why I saw that and I liked the part that you were a part of. And so I said, I'm going to hit this guy up on LinkedIn, and here we are a couple of weeks later, we're having a great conversation. So
I'm glad you did.
That's what's cool with the world. Well, Dr. Art Markman, it's been awesome having you on here. Really appreciate your time and all your wisdom you share with us today on the Circuit of Success.
Well, Brett, thanks so much for having me.
Tune in next week for another episode of The Circuit of Success with Brett Gilliland on the lineupmedia.fm podcast network. Subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and through our website, circuitofsuccess.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and email any questions to info@circuitofsuccess.com.
This podcast was a presentation of lineupmedia.fm.